Welcome to the Brute Facts Podcast with your host and everybody's favorite Christian, Eddie Kroom. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell for future content.
Welcome to Brute Facts. Got a fun one tonight, just like I always say. Thank you, Pasta Mike, for doing that wonderful professional-looking intro. You can check him out over at Normalizing Atheism. He has his own channel now. Pretty high-class, state-of-the-art kind of editing. Tonight I have Ben Watkins, a philosophy friend of mine. We have talked for years now. Used to have it out quite a bit, but that was when he was more of a new atheist and I was a bit more ignorant in philosophy. So it was fun times. Good guy now. So he is with Real Atheology, and I am going to bring him on and let him tell us a little bit about himself. How's it going, Ben?
I cannot hear you.
All right.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay.
Go to your, I think where it says cam and mic, and then audio, and see what your output is for speakers, and make sure it's on. Oh yeah, he can't hear me. Let me.
Can you hear me? I cannot hear you.
Yeah, 1 second. Sorry, folks. Live show. Stuff happens. I'm going to bounce him out real quick and see if I can get him set up. It was working before we started. I'm not sure why it's not working now. Let's see.
Can you hear me now?
I can hear you. Can you hear? Okay. Do you have some headphone? Okay. Do you have some headphones? Because they say that there's a pretty bad echo on your end. All right. Do you guys still hear an echo in the chat?
Test. Do y'all still hear an echo?
Anybody in the chat?
An echo?
Anybody?
Echo? Does anyone still hear an echo?
Well, nobody's responding, so guess they're not hearing an echo.
Responding.
I'll tell you what. Yeah. Hold on a second. Let me check over here. Responding, so guess they're not hearing. I'll tell you what. Yeah. Hold on a second. Let me check over here. Okay, they're saying it's good.
Yeah.
All right. Yeah. Let's try this again. Welcome, Ben.
Oh, thank you for having me. Sorry about that.
No, it's all good, man. That's the thing about doing a live show is we don't get to edit it out. So we just kind of roll it. My last show, the guest cut off. His computer crashed with like just a few minutes left in the show, right in the middle of a nail hanger. So, or a cliffhanger or whatever you call it.
Sure.
Yeah. So, tell us a little bit about yourself. You were a Christian and became an atheist. What made you kind of make that transition?
Yeah, so I grew up in Columbia, South Carolina. So in a conservative, Quaker-like home. So I didn't go to a traditional church as a place of worship. We went to someone's house as more of a Bible study setting. And so it was about after I graduated from college that I started to say, okay, well, what, I had come of age, so to speak, and, what was it that I really believed as far as my serious theological beliefs, and how was I going to live out the rest of my life? was this sort of consideration? And so that's when I kind of got into apologetics and philosophy of religion. And so really what it was just kind of struggling with doubts. I started asking certain questions, and I started to be dissatisfied with the answers that I was getting to those questions. And the more I started to probe at certain questions, the more I started to think that some were just insoluble. And so eventually I just kind of came to realize, I was like, okay, I think I'm just in the atheist camp. I kind of went through, it was a progression of, I wasn't a Christian. I was, maybe a Buddhist or some other non-Christian tradition. And then I kind of had a deist phase. And then I had kind of an agnostic phase where I was just like, well, I just don't know. And then it was, I finally got to the point where I was like, okay, I think when the evidential chips have fallen, this is where I think the weight of evidence leans towards is a rejection of perfect being theism. And so one of the things that I wanted to do with my Real Atheology project was to approach these big questions and issues in the philosophy of religion from a perspective in which we have already rejected theism. So the idea is that if you've come to the conclusion that something like perfect being theism is false, what can religion look like afterwards? What does it mean for something in the world to be worthy of our worship? What are the functions of things like faith or prayer in our lives if we've already rejected something like that? Can we still believe in something like life after death or morality or rationality or all these different things? What does it look like once we've already rejected perfect being theism? And so instead of a project in which I contrast with something like the new atheism, the idea is not to bash on theism. It's to contribute substantively to the dialogue and to try to develop this particular position in the great debate. So I try to take a more serious and balanced approach to criticism, and I also take more risks when it comes to putting ideas out there.
Yeah, that's what I like about about talking with you, especially these days. It's far more pleasant, but yeah, I mean, you weren't that bad. It was just a lot of us kind of new to philosophy, kind of bouncing off each other, and so now would you consider are you more agnostic, or would you consider yourself a strong atheist, or where do you kind of land there?
So I consider myself an atheist. So what do I mean by that claim? What would it look like for a claim like that to be true? And so I start with the idea of a disembodied mind. And so I'm an atheist in a broad sense, in that I don't believe that there are these disembodied minds. In fact, I think that we have good reasons to believe that there aren't minds such as this. And I'm an atheist in a much narrower sense too, and that I reject the particular theisms of the Western monotheisms, perfect being theism of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. So I'm an atheist in the sense that I believe that picture of the divine is false. And so I have pushed back a lot on what has often been called the Lackiest definition of atheism, this idea that atheism is just this lack of belief in theism. And I think that we already have a term for that. It's non-theism. You're just not a theist if you just lack the belief that God is. I take a much more substantive position in the philosophy of religion, in that I want to say that the claim theism is true, that claim is false, and that the claim atheism is true, that claim is true, and that I mean something very specific about that claim in at least two different senses: this wide sense of a disembodied mind, and this more narrow sense of a perfect being. Those are both conceptions
Right.
that I believe are false, but not necessarily for the same reasons.
Yeah, and when I'm talking with different atheists from different areas, I, kind of just get their idea of what, they think atheism is. I know a lot of people, I mean, quite a few will still say, it's just a lack of belief. And I just don't get into, arguing about that, because I know what they mean by being an atheist. And for the most part, I think a lot of the newer atheists, you know, don't realize that, at least as far as I'm familiar in the literature, that it's really a positive proposition, to be an atheist. It's, a theist is God, is one who believes in God. So the negation would be, or theism is God exists. The negation would be God doesn't. Which, for the most part is a positive proposition, but I don't get into, arguing with a lot of atheists what they mean by it. So, I have watched you kind of, evolve through, I want to say, you were Humean at one time, weren't you?
Well, so in certain respects, I am a Humean.
Yeah,
so
but
David Hume has been very, very influential on how I think and the objections that I take seriously. Yeah, Hume and then Kant, and I have made my transition to the dark side complete in transitioning to Hegel. So it's there's definitely been a trajectory from Hume to Hegel and now that I'm kind of on this Hegelian end of it, I'm like, how did I get here? I don't understand. I don't understand this.
I wondered the same thing, with this Hegelian views, because, that's continental philosophy, right? That's the kind of, it's not analytic. It's really just, it's one of those.
So if you had said this claim, 20 years ago, you would have been spot on. It would have been this idea that, or maybe more like 30 years ago, but it was this idea that Hegel was kind of this relic of the past that was relegated to this continental tradition of philosophy. But Hegel has had something of a resurgence since the 1980s, 1990s. So in the analytic tradition, though he is still widely despised and something of a very small minority among analytic philosophers who really even take him seriously or think that he has anything interesting to add to something like the analytic tradition.
Yeah, it's funny because it's if you want to be a philosopher to be remembered, just be as abstract as possible, and then have about 15 books written about what you really meant. And that's what I've seen about.
There's really some irony here because I consider myself an analytic in the sense that I was brought up in the analytic tradition. I write in the analytic tradition. I work in an analytic tradition. And so I put a great deal of emphasis on clarity and brevity of thought. And those are just not Kant and Hegel. Like, how did I end up in this camp? Like, how is it that I was, because when I started my philosophical journey, I was very much opposed to the Platonic, Kantian, Hegelian part of the tradition, the rationalist sort of. And perhaps that was bias from, reading, I started my journey with Bertrand Russell's A History of Philosophy. So I'm sure he poisoned the well a little bit there. There might be all kinds of reasons why I just had this, I just didn't get them. And now if you were to ask, like Plato, Kant, and Hegel are like the figures that I turn to, and Hume as well. They're just figures that when I'm developing my own thoughts, it's just very easy to reference them. It's very easy to use their material. It's very easy to just pick up the themes that they gave us and examine certain questions in very interesting ways. And so while I don't agree with any of them on everything, certainly not everything, there are certain themes to each thinker that I really appreciate, that I think that were very revolutionary in the history of thought in thinking about these, in that they shifted the way in which we think about some of these questions. And I think people ask, does philosophy make progress? And I think the answer is yes. It might be rare. It's not the same way in which something like the natural sciences make progress, but it does make progress. Our concepts do get better, and that process of doing it is what drives, I think, things like the natural sciences and history and things like economics. I think all of these things built on humanities, the humanities are built on these sorts of types of inquiry.
So yeah, and I've talked with you at length, even preparing for a debate, with ethics, and that seems to be an area that you enjoy the most. Is that kind of you still do a lot of the ethical philosophies, or?
Oh, absolutely. So I started my journey in philosophy as a whole in philosophy of religion, which is just a great place to start your philosophical journey because it touches on so many different areas. And one of those areas was moral philosophy, or what's called ethics. And so while I was going through this philosophy of religion phase, I was also had entangled with it this moral philosophy phase, where I really got into questions of applied ethics, of normative ethics, and of meta ethics, and trying to articulate my own view, because I had certain intuitions that I had worked with and others that I had kind of worked away. I was like, I thought, okay, I think this might be the case. And then I worked through those intuitions and realized that they were confused and mistaken. And then I worked out other intuitions. I was like, okay, I think these are the ones, this is where I think things are going. And so really developed within the philosophy of religion my own way of approaching what I call the moral, or what is often called the moral argument for the existence of God and its relationship to an atheological argument, the problem of evil. And so one of the themes that you'll find in apologetics discussions is that the status of morality becomes quite a focal point of discussion. A lot of things are said to turn on this idea of the status of morality, whether it's has a subjective foundation or this more robustly objective foundation. And so the answer to that question is supposed to have really, really big implications for the philosophy of religion for both sides. The theist wants to argue that this idea of an objective morality, this idea of having a real, realist view of morality is going to require something like God, whereas the atheologian is going to say, look, because there are these things that matter in the world in this robustly objective sense, this implies that there is no perfect being, because if there was a perfect being, there wouldn't be these kinds of horrible evils that we observe in the world. And so the idea of the relationship, the intersection of this dialectic, that's where I've found myself most interested, in the sense that I think there's a wide range of ways in which someone in my camp who is a secular moral realist has a lot of room to affect the dialogue, to really come in and help us see certain things from interesting perspectives. So, for example, to come back to Plato, there's a famous dialogue called the Euthyphro Dilemma. And so there's controversy within the dialectic between apologists and atheologians of what exactly the Euthyphro Dilemma is and what exactly the implications of it are. And so I give a secular realist interpretation of the Euthyphro Dilemma. And so I think that my way of characterizing the dilemma and teasing out the implications of it are better than the apologists' approach to it in trying to split the horns of the dilemma and to insist that it's a kind of false dilemma. So I think that I've provided at least some useful tools that I have gotten from elsewhere within my moral philosophy journey to, I think, can help us understand what's really going on here and why our conception of ethics should shift away from this theologically voluntarist idea of morality and more towards a more robustly objectivist, reason-implying conception of morality. So the idea here is that the disagreement is conceptual. It's not merely that we're having a semantic disagreement. It's not merely that we're having a theoretical disagreement about the implications of certain theories. It's that there's a conceptual difference in what we think morality is. And so you're going to have to compare what these, how these two concepts approach these big questions. And so I found a lot of really interesting and I think fruitful conversation and dialogue to be had there.
Yeah, that's in my opinion, in my experience, I am less inclined to use any kind of moral argument for theism because I don't think it's real powerful. Two, there are so many different, secular explanations for morality that I find, at least on the surface of it, plausible. There's enough explanation there, that without really going into, an argument about grounding and things of that nature, I think are, perfectly rational positions. So I don't often use the moral argument. Of course, and I'm not an apologist. I consider myself a philosopher in philosophy of religion. I don't care for going around defending or trying to convert people and things like that. I mean, somebody asks me what I believe and why, I tell them, and that's kind of, my position. So, although I do like to debate time to time, that's a little fun. I know you were a categorical imperative guy for a while. So where have you kind of settled at this point?
So I'm still kind of a categorical imperative guy, but the idea is, what do we mean by a categorical imperative? Do we mean exactly what Kant says about categorical imperative, or do we have some sort of better idea, more improved idea? And I am of the thought that we can have a concept of a categorical imperative, in the idea that we can say that moral obligations are categorical. And so what do we mean by that? I mean that anyone in a particular situation, if you could put any other subject in that position and they would have the same moral obligation. So it's this idea that morality is something that's self-imposed. So it's autonomous. So you give yourself principles that you could also at the same time will to be a universal law, such that everyone could rationally will this principle. And so what that means is that this principle applies to anyone in a similar circumstance. So morality doesn't discriminate between moral agents. If you're a moral agent, if you can appreciate a moral reason not to do something, that reason applies to everyone exceptionlessly. It doesn't mean that there are no exceptions to our moral rules. That idea of a categorical imperative, I don't think is workable. But the idea that morality applies to every agent in certain circumstances, regardless of who the agent is, I think that's the essence of a categorical imperative. So what would the $1 million question is, well, what would something like a categorical imperative look like? And I think it would look something like the idea that we should always treat someone in a way that they could rationally will. If you ever treated someone in a way, if they could not rationally contain the same aim in which you're using to treat them by, then it would always be wrong to treat someone in this way. And it would be wrong for anyone in a similar situation to treat someone in that way. And so a simple example could be something like torture. Someone could not rationally contain the end of being tortured for its own sake. So it would always be wrong to torture small children for fun. That would be something that would follow from the categorical imperative, because the principle, don't torture children merely for fun, is a principle that everyone could rationally will. It would apply to any moral agent capable of appreciating it. And so that's what I think we mean by a categorical imperative, and what is essential to something like morality. It couldn't be the case that I would be morally required to do something in a certain situation, but you were not morally required to do something in the same situation with the same non-moral facts. Only our positions were switched. We would have the same moral obligations. Similarly, there would be no moral distinction between a divine moral agent and a finite moral agent like us. So it wouldn't be the case that God just didn't have moral obligations on this view. My view implies that no, a categorical imperative implies that even God has moral obligation. If it's wrong for us to torture children merely for fun, it's wrong for God to torture children merely for fun.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah. That's, and with a lot of people that try to, instead of understand like the Old Testament and its context, they try to justify how it's okay for God to do certain things, and we're not allowed to do them. And I don't even get into those kind of arguments because, I kind of lean towards, like what you're saying, that, I mean, if it's objectively wrong, it's objectively wrong. I don't think that there are, certain things like torturing people for the fun of it that could be justified by anybody, even a deity, so it doesn't make any sense to me. But so kind of shifting gears from there, when you went to, you kind of inherited Real Atheology, didn't you?
Correct.
Wasn't it?
Yes.
I think it was Justin that
it was Justin
ran.
Schieber. So Justin Schieber, it was the project that kind of dovetailed. He was also part of the Reasonable Doubts podcast project. And so when he, kind of went off to do his own project, it was Real Atheology. And so he and I met online years ago. I couldn't tell you what year we met each other, but we met each other in person in 2016 at the Reason Rally in Washington, D.C. And we really hit it off in the sense that we were both really into philosophy of religion. And we were interested in doing these sorts of projects. And so I was familiar with him through his Real Atheology project, and he was familiar with me. I was, I guess you could say, up in the philosophy of religion circuits, up and coming, in that, people were starting to pay more and more attention to the things that I was arguing about, and the positions that I was skeptical of, and the positions that I was defending. And so he brought me on as a co-host because he wanted to expand what was originally kind of a YouTube channel type thing into a more sophisticated podcast format that was also conversational. So the idea is that we wanted to interview people from all sides and to see how we could make progress on certain issues in the philosophy of religion, both historical and current, because we felt like that was really missing from the atheological camp. The new atheist projects don't typically take these sort of things on, more likely than not because they think that it's just not worth the time to do it. And we are that's just how we distinguish ourselves from the new atheists. We think that it is something worth doing, and that it is important to be informed when it comes to the big questions of not just the philosophy of religion, but just in any area of philosophy, where the questions matter, where the questions are connected to living a good life or living an examined life. It's these are the kinds of perennial questions that we have to take seriously, even if we disagree with the answers on the other side. There's work that needs to be done, and there should be places to facilitate the conversations that people should be having.
Yeah, absolutely. That's I mean, I've actually with us being in this, same groups, same circles and stuff, I've seen where you've actually, posted like arguments for God and interacted with those arguments. And I think it's pretty cool that you have somebody out there because I'm a Graham Oppy kind of person. I love the way that Graham Oppy comes, at philosophy of religion. And shameless plug, he's going to be on my show. But it's that charitable position, where we have this human condition. Everybody's a human. We all have our different subjective experiences. We all have our own kind of epistemology and how we come at, things that we come to believe and things like that. And I think, working within that framework and being more charitable towards each other, from the theist side too, it makes for great, conversation. It makes for progress in philosophy, at least conceptually, where we can try to refine and hone, the ideas that we have, and, teach other people better ways to think and to accept things like that. So that's definitely something I enjoy about you and quite a few other of the, atheists that I've been, friends with in philosophy of religion for quite a while, is the charitable approach to it and wanting to actually interact with these different arguments and things. So when you took over, was Ben before there to begin with, or did he kind of come in and help you, or I don't remember.
Yeah, so when Justin Schieber decided to step back and pursue higher education and kind of go a different direction, I brought in Ben Bavar and John Lapolito as co-hosts, and John Lapolito has also since left the project to focus more on family stuff. And so I have since brought on my good friend Ryan Downey.
Yeah, I like Ryan.
Yeah, so Ryan Downey is kind of our third partner in crime, and then we've got a couple people that are working behind the scenes as well that don't really help out so much as far as hosting the show, but more in just the research we're doing. So really, it's kind of a book club. My project is a book club that draws from multiple pools of people, and then we just put in podcast form the results of that book club. Kind of like what things were interesting to us, and what areas of dialogue that we have that we find interesting, and put them out there for other people to dialogue about and reflect about, to see if because again, we think that this is. We don't have the new atheist approach of being like, there is no evidence for God and there are no good arguments for God. Like, look, there are certain considerations that could be considered evidence for God, and there are super interesting arguments for God, and there's just even thinking about them in general makes us better thinkers in general, because it challenges us in certain ways. So to give an example, I'm getting ready to do a discussion with my good friend Travis Worth on the fine-tuning argument. And so in preparing for that discussion, I'm an engineer by career, and so my degree is in engineering. I took probabilities and statistics.
Engineering.
Yeah, I took it 14, 15 years ago, so it's certainly very, very rusty. So going through all this stuff again has refreshed me with probability theory, and so I feel like it's like riding a bike again. I'm like, oh, okay, yeah, I remember that, and like I'm finding myself being able to read certain things much faster whereas before I was having to stop and look certain things up or stop and think about the relationship between certain concept. Okay, well, this refers to this concept and it's related to this one. Now I can just kind of read it naturally, and so that it has to be good for at least that.
Yeah, exactly. That's I actually, even at my age, I just enrolled to complete engineering degree in mechanical engineering because
That's what my undergrad is. It's mechanical. We're a strange breed for sure.
It's but I've dealt with I started out in HVAC and then went over to working on battery backup systems for data centers. So I have a lot of electrical background and mechanical background. So it's natural. And I was hoping to maybe be able to flip over and pursue philosophy, once I get that secured. So, but enough about me. With the I do want to come back to that fine tuning because Travis had said something about it in the chat. But something interesting that you said that I would like to, really make it good and clear. And that's one of the things, like when I'm talking with, newer atheists and things like that, it's, I try to get them to understand, you don't have to say there's no evidence for God. You can absolutely admit that there's possible evidence, or some things may seem to point towards a God, and that doesn't really, harm your position nor give credence to, the other position if you are, so reluctant to consider that side or came from that side. So what would you think? I mean, in your opinion, what is the strongest arguments for theism? Looking at it from, your point of view.
So, from my point of view, I see the arguments for the existence of God in a broad category of different arguments that are all themselves have families of arguments. And so the ones that are most often cited are the cosmological argument, the teleological argument, the ontological argument, and the moral argument. And I think that the ontological argument is a completely useless piece of natural theology. So I've been pushed pretty heavily on this. I don't think that the ontological argument is really a serious piece of natural theology. And now there's plenty of people that disagree with me, and they think that I move too fast in my criticisms of the ontological argument, and that I should take it more seriously. And so I'm trying to get there, but I'm still just of the opinion that this just isn't a good argument. It's a neat little philosophical paradox. We get a lot of value from thinking about it and discussing it, and it has an important place in the history of philosophy. But as a piece of natural theology, as something that is going to be appealed to resolve disagreements between disagreeing camps, I don't think it's going to do that. It's just
I had Joe Schmidt on. Yeah, I had Joe Schmidt on, and he did a fantastic job of illuminating quite a few issues with it, which I'm not a big fan of it anyway. I do understand. I mean, I have, interacted with it and read lots on it because I was intrigued by it. But even if you're convinced by it, it's extremely unconvincing, to other people, because it really is.
That it's like you're being, there's a mistake, and you might not be able to point exactly to where the mistake is. That's how most people, the phenomenology of this argument goes, is they're like, okay, there must be some sort of trick here.
There's
it feels like I'm
there.
Now, while I think that the moral argument is not sound, I don't think it's and it's can be very closely related to ontological arguments and be mistaken for similar reasons that ontological arguments are. I think there is something very natural about the idea that God plays some sort of essential role in morality, or that there is an inherent plausibility to the idea that a moral law requires a moral lawgiver. Now, granted, that plausibility might be merely rhetorical, but it's plausible in a way that God is so great that he just must exist just isn't plausible. So I think the moral argument and the ontological argument are dead ends. And I think that if we're going to be serious natural theologians, that our focuses should shift more towards the cosmological argument and the teleological arguments, because I think that that's where the more interesting arguments are, in the sense that they have the potential to resolve disagreements between disagreeing parties. We could, in principle, with these sorts of considerations, say, okay, I think that the weight of evidence falls clearly in this side or in this side. So when it comes to cosmological arguments, I'm most sympathetic to arguments from contingency. This might be the influence of Hegel on me, in the sense that I find something like the principle of sufficient reason, I'm sympathetic with it. Although I also recognize that there are serious challenges to the principle of sufficient reason. It may or may not be true. Or there might be a weak form that's true and stronger forms that are false. There's super interesting discussion around that, but I think it's the idea that the universe has this necessary foundation. Now, I think there's problems going from a necessary foundation to God, but I think that this is an area in which the conversations are interesting. It's not obviously mistaken, and we could potentially see a paradigm shift here. If the work here were to progress in such a way that was so compelling, perhaps there is a paradigm shift to be had here. The other area that I think we can have that is in teleological arguments. Teleological arguments have kind of had something of a resurgence lately, because Darwin really kind of just did the damage to the teleological argument in the 18th century or 19th century, I'm sorry, and early certainly the first half of the 20th century. The cosmological argument was the philosopher's argument par excellence. But now the teleological argument has made something of a comeback, partly because of things like the modern resurgence of something like intelligence in design, but also because of the fine-tuning data that we have discovered with the physical constants and initial conditions of the universe. And so what I think is the most interesting teleological argument is a variation of the fine-tuning argument, but it doesn't stop with the idea that the universe is fine-tuned for life. It says that no, the universe is fine-tuned for moral agents that can make significantly free decisions that have moral consequences within a much larger moral arena. And so the idea that there are embodied moral agents that can causally influence the moral arena in morally significant ways is not something that you would predict on something like metaphysical naturalism. But we do have some antecedent reason to think that a world like that would be created by a perfect being who cared about having a morally significant relationship with their creation. So I think that this is one area in which it's not obvious that it's wrong. And I certainly grant that this argument that I'm putting forward liberally makes use of premises that others might challenge. The idea that we are libertarian free agents that can make morally significant decisions in a moral arena. This is explicitly assuming a libertarian account of free will. And most philosophers are not libertarian incompatibilists about free will. They're compatibilists. So I admit that there are areas in which this argument can seemingly be attacked pretty heavily, but on balance with the other teleological arguments that I've encountered, like ones that's focused specifically on the constants, or ones that appeal to something like an irreducible complexity, like the ID theorists like Behe do. I think this moral agency argument is just it's just a better argument. I think that if we're going to have a paradigm shift, back it to in favor of teleological arguments, we're more likely going to get it here than we are in something like intelligent design in the biological domain, or just focusing on life and the physical constants. I think there are problems with those formulations, and we can kind of smooth over some of those problems by shifting the focus to moral agents. But that's where I think the most promising argument is. It's the one that I think about the most. And so I think about it the most because I think it's the best.
Yeah, and it's funny because you and I are almost dead on par, because a lot of people who know me have often heard me say, if I wasn't convinced by, the truth of Christianity, I would at least be a deist. And the reason being is because of the modal contingency, and mainly the modal contingency argument and the fine-tuning argument, more like along the lines of what Luke Barnes presents, focusing on the fine-tuning for carbon life, and not so much the intelligent design argument. I'm not a big fan of the intelligent design biologically, the irreducible complexity and those things. I just that almost seems like a Texas sharpshooter fallacy. It just we're looking at these things. We're organic creatures that look for design in things all the time. We look for patterns. We look for these kind of things. So, but given that, yeah, I'm right there with you. The cosmological arguments to me, mainly contingency argument and fine tuning, are the most powerful, in which I would at least be a deist if I wasn't a Christian. But I'd like to know what you were talking about, the moral agency from teleology. Can you touch on that a little more?
So the teleological argument is synonymous with design argument, or the argument for design. And so why do they call it the teleological argument? And they call it the teleological argument because it's there is seemingly order or goal directedness in the world. It seems like there is something in which the world is aiming towards. So this idea of aiming towards something is telos, the Greek word telos, meaning aim or goal. So the teleological argument is looking for some sort of goal directedness in the world. And so the idea that there's life is something we take for granted, but there is also intelligent life. Life didn't have to be intelligent. It could just be life, just all non-intelligent life. But then there's also not only intelligent life, but life that can appreciate moral principles and can ask itself the question, what ought I do? And can give more or less true answers to that question. And they can affect other people in ways that are morally significant as well. It could have been the case that there was life, intelligent life, but it wasn't morally significant intelligent life. There is morally significant intelligent life. So it seems like there's this idea of progressively goal directedness, in the sense that with the universe is us slowly waking up, because the universe tended towards beings like us, and we are slowly awakening from this essentially teleological process, and that this teleology is driven by God's desires, God's wants, God's goals. He sees the moral agents in the moral arena are the telos, and his desires and intentions or aims are directed at them, and he causally influences the world in ways to bring about that aim. And that God's creative acts in the world are what explain why there's this order rather than some other order or disorder. So that's the idea. That's my fundamental understanding of what a teleological argument is trying to do. And so the telos on the argument that I most sympathize with, moral agency, sees that moral agency and that moral arena in which we focus in. So I don't necessarily think that the constants being fine-tuned are evidence for theism, but we can say on something like single universe naturalism, where there's only our observable universe, we can say that, look, these conditions are very, very, very improbable. And so that's still a very significant claim. That's still something that can move the scales.
Especially if something like a multiverse theory was true, or we found some type of evidence for it, then it would definitely put a significant blow to just the fine-tuning aspect of it. So would that be something that could tie in?
So that's I think that's one of the more interesting areas of that particular discussion, and one that atheists don't necessarily engage with like they should. So the multiverse, as I understand it, is the idea that there are many different causally unconnected universes. And so there's the idea of, well, life permitting constants and initial conditions are likely in some universe. It has to be the case because there's infinitely many of it. But the question that we're trying to address in the probability calculus is, why does our universe have the constants that it does fall where they do, and that range is narrow? Why is that the case rather than something else? And I don't think the multiverse can explain that. The datum that we get from the multiverse, the idea that some universe is fine-tuned, isn't the datum we need. The datum we need is our universe is fine-tuned. And why is that the case? It can't just be because some universe is. Then we'd have to add something like an anthropic principle in order to get there. And so if we're already taking into account an anthropic principle, then we've already opened up a whole nother bucket of fish. We've opened up the idea of observation selection effects, but I won't get into all that.
Not only that, I think the multiverse theory actually tends to just kind of push it back a little bit anyway. We still have other issues you have to deal with when it comes to the multiverse theory. So what kind of, do you mind taking a question? We actually had somebody in the chat that wanted
to please.
Ask a question. Yeah, Titan wanted to know, could morals not be derived from empathy, chosen for by evolution, because intercooperative species are generally more successful than purely competitive species?
Okay, so this is a really great question, if only for the reason that it helps me make, I think, a very, very crucial point, a point that I would like to get across to people. So this question itself assumes a particular view of morality. So the question was, can't we just derive morality from empathy? So that's a loaded question. That's assuming that morality is derived from empathy, that it's something derivative of something else. So me, as an anti-reductionist, I believe that morality is primitive. So we can't just derive it out of something else. So if we're talking about empathy, we're talking about motivating reasons. We're talking about human psychology. We're talking about the causal connection of how it makes people act. So if you're asking the question, can't we have moral motivation that's derivative from empathy? The answer is yes. But the question, I think, is more, can we have moral justification that's derivative from empathy? Well, if you're like me and you believe that moral justification is objective and doesn't depend on anything subjective, you're not going to derive moral justification from empathy. Empathy is a subjective characteristic. Morality is objective. So empathy can be right or wrong. So I could be empathetic towards Hitler, and I could be not empathetic towards someone like Mother Teresa. That empathy would just be mistaken because I might be morally motivated, but I'm morally motivated in ways that are unjustified or that are morally objectionable. So
Yeah,
this is the idea. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say, yeah, that's kind of along the lines of the responses I usually give when people talk about, given evolution and morality and moral obligations and things like that. Because somebody says that, you have a moral intuition or you feel that you should do certain moral things, that still doesn't tell us what morality is and why it's objective. It just says, hey, it may have been pragmatic. It may have been something that did possibly develop, through evolution and things like this, but it doesn't tell us what morality is. It doesn't tell us why there's this objective nature to it. So it doesn't, it's not really explaining, in my opinion, what, moral duties or moral obligations are. Because like you said, with, just intuitions or empathy or things of that nature, we all have, different intuitions to a certain extent, or, empathy to different to a certain extent. And there's being objective like it is. If one person's intuition or the empathy, combats with another's, then how do you distinguish between the two if it's not an objective moral fact? So, yeah, getting from there to I wanted to give you a chance to talk about where they can find you with Real Atheology. I was going to put the YouTube link, but it doesn't look like you guys do too much YouTube stuff anymore. And and being as, of course, you will understand completely when I say, being as ADHD as I am, I forgot to ask about a website link for the podcast. So where can they find you, where you are the most active?
So obviously our Facebook page is where we're the most active. Our Facebook and our Twitter, I should say, Real Atheology, a Philosophy of Religion podcast. Obviously you can find us as well on Podbean or Apple iTunes. Pretty much wherever your favorite podcast is found, we're on that platform. And so the past year or two, with the pandemic and all the things that have been going on as well, we've shifted our focus more towards interviews like this, debates and discussions, than we have been on interviews. But hopefully we're going to be turning that around here pretty soon to put more content out there. We were doing a Thomism project. It's been going on for about 2 or maybe even 3 years now. So it was a really, really big project. So we finally, I think, wrapped that up. So we're probably going to be doing some new and exciting things here in the next year or two.
Sweet. Yeah, I'll definitely be looking forward to that. I catch, some of your stuff time to time, kind of feel a little obligated, at least, we've kind of, tit for tat for a while. So the real important question is, what are you listening to on your iPhone right now when you're not on the interview?
Right now, when I'm not on my interview, so I'm listening to at least 3 different things right now. So the first thing is I'm re-listening to We Are Legion. It's a series from the Multiverse. I'm reading that. I'm reading Robert Nozick's Anarchy, State, and Utopia. So it's a classic in the canon of political philosophy, and I've read a lot about it, and I'm indirectly familiar with it, and I'm finally getting around to finally listening to it. And then I'm rereading Daniel Dennett's Consciousness Explained. Again, it's a staple in the canon of philosophy of mind. And I read it very early in my journey on the philosophy. I'm going back to reread it to see, okay, can I get something else from this? Because in the philosophy of mind, like in moral philosophy, I'm also in the anti-reductionist camp.
Yes.
So I
Thank
find
you.
myself in disagreement. I'm in the John Searle and Daniel Dennett have famous exchange of debates between the two of them, and I find myself fairly clearly in the John Searle camp. Not the biggest fan of John Searle as a person, but
Yeah, I know. Yeah, it's that's a topic for a different day. I've actually
yeah,
been watching his lectures on semantics, trying to
he's really
get a,
smart. He's probably the most influential philosopher of language since Wittgenstein. I think he's absolutely brilliant.
him and
But when he
Chomsky are the
misses the
two I've
mark,
been.
he misses the mark. When he misses
Yeah,
when he misses the mark, he misses it by a lot. It's really
yeah,
weird.
yeah. Him and Chomsky are two of them I've been listening to a lot, trying to get a little more into the philosophy of language. Trying to learn because I cringe when people are having debates or things like that, and somebody says, "Oh, we're just arguing semantics," and I'm like, "Ah,
That's really
that is
important.
the
That's
argument."
what we mean. That's what we mean when we're talking. That's what our claims mean. Like it's a pet peeve of mine too. Like
It is.
well, that's just semantics. That's really important.
That's what we're that's the biggest part of the debate is knowing, you gotta the semantics and the pragmatics of it. You have to know, the what they mean by the statements they're making, and then what they actually intend by those statements. Because I think even with, a lot of professional philosophers, you see so much talking past each other because you have to clarify exactly what you mean and intend with the statements you're making. And as soon as I hear we're arguing semantics, I'm just like, oh man, yeah, that's the
Those who know
point.
me know that I'm a pretty big grammar Nazi, and for reasons just like this. Like it's I'm one of those people that I process what people say, and when someone uses a concept wrong or says whoa, stop, wait, what did
That's
there's multiple ways in which I can interpret what you're saying, and I need you to be more clear. And it's not that we're just it's a semantic disagreement. No, I'm trying to understand what you're saying, and there's multiple things you could mean here. Please be more clear.
absolutely.
And
And
it happens
I
all the
got a couple
time.
of friends. Yeah, I got a couple of friends in the chat now, and they hate when they ask me direct questions that I just don't directly answer them. And I'm like, some of these questions you don't ask a philosopher and expect an immediate answer.
Philosophers are aware of the conceptual confusion on a lot of these issues too. Like philosophers are notorious for trying to make things more clear, but in doing so, making things much more confused and muddled. And
Yes.
the reason that paradox exists is because most people are very, very conceptually confused about
Yeah.
the questions that they're asking and the answers that they expect other people to be able to answer. And to weed through those conceptual confusions takes time. It's very difficult. It's a skill that is developed over time. It's not
Yeah.
something that you can just take a class on and just go do.
Yeah. I can't count how many times I've been asked, so why do you believe? And I'm just like thinking for a second at the easiest possible way to answer it. And I'm just like, it's not a simple answer. It's going,
Yeah,
we're going to have to we're going to have to flesh this out. No, I just need to know why you believe. And it doesn't take this
I'm an
elaborate
atheist.
answer.
I'm an atheist, but if I hear two people ask, "Does God exist?" and one of them says no, and the other one says, "Well, what do you mean by God?" I'm more inclined, like, I want to hear what the guy who's like, he's the one that recognizes, like, this is a big question. So it's really going to depend. Like, you're expecting an answer. The only way I can give you the answer that you're expecting in a way that's going to make sense to you is if we're using the same concepts. And maybe we are or we aren't. You don't know. It's
Right.
one of those. It's philosophers. Daniel Dennett calls them intuition pumps, and philosophers, they know these potential pitfalls. They've seen them in the history of philosophy. They've seen them in play out in contemporary debates. And so when
Right.
they come up again. They go, ding. Okay,
That-
this is potential problems here, so be careful.
Yeah, that in I mean, I don't know to what extent with you, but with me, when I got into philosophy, I mean, I knew nothing, so I learned to be really, really careful with what I say and how
I
I
was
say
worried.
it.
I not only knew nothing, but I was not even aware that I knew nothing. I thought that, I had finished college. I had an engineering degree. I was like, I've got all the base knowledge that I could need. I have at my disposal, and I can go. And so I just didn't even have that Socratic attitude. And so I started at the very, very bottom of the barrel and had to work my way up to try to, because the discussions can get very heated. And, when people first challenged me on my faith, I didn't respond in the best sorts of ways because I was just like, I didn't really understand why people would be skeptical as they were of the beliefs that just seemed like I grew up in a conservative
Natural belief. Yeah.
Yeah, it was just it's natural. It's just one of those assumptions that you went along with unquestioned, and so then when it finally was questioned, it felt really uncomfortable. And so a lot of that journey was just learning to be more and more comfortable with the idea of uncertainty, and that there are these big questions that are just bigger than where I am and the point, the kind of mind I have and the point in time that I'm at. There are some questions that are just bigger than that.
Yeah. Yeah, you had that planning properly basic belief of that's for another episode. Well, it's funny because I was
get all my journalists up in here and just start bashing on you.
Well, I actually was considered myself Reformed epistemologist for a long time. I loved planning. I loved the externalist position, and I've actually shifted in the last few years to internalist evidentialist.
Welcome to the dark side, my friend.
That's I'm more of a Bayesian epistemology guy now. It's I do understand the issues pointed out on both sides.
I'm giving you a hard time, if only because I'm an internalist or an externalist, depending on the day of the week and in which phase I am. It's one of those discussions that I just cannot nail down, and I sympathize with both camps. And so I give people a hard time for something that clearly applies to me. I can only throw a stone so far before it hits my own glass house.
Do you know what bothered me the most about externalism and reformed epistemology specifically was the Christians who hold to a fideistic faith, where faith is opposed to reason. It's just this epistemic knowledge that you have without just getting from the Bible. I thought that it to me it gave, it's not the main reason I got away from it, but it was one of the big issues I had with it. It allowed them to be warranted in their beliefs that they had, because when you hold to, you can actually defend a fideistic kind of faith using reformed epistemology, because of and of course it's not justified, it's just warranted a weaker claim on it. So that was one of the big things that I was just like, I'm not gonna give these epistemic lazy people a reason to say that they're warranted in this this idea of faith that they have, where they just take things that the Bible says is true. And that's another episode too. So yeah, I moved over to the dark side.
You could really get yourself into a rabbit hole here if you're not careful, because this is where I bring how has Hegel been influential on me? It's trying to address these issues, this internalist, externalist discussion, and I think that Hegel has some really neat insights and themes to approach these questions with. But again, we won't get into that rabbit hole.
Yeah, I think it's one of those things where you're an externalist when it benefits you, and you're an internalist when it benefits you.
and I'm a skeptic. So the only thing that I'm sure of is that skeptic is wrong. And so I take my cue my favorite argument in all of philosophy is G.E. Moore's hands argument, that I have hands, and it refutes external world skepticism. And I absolutely love that argument, just because I think it's the greatest philosophy troll argument. And it's almost irrefutable. It's almost irrefutable, and I love it. And so I'm convinced that the skeptic position, but so I think that externalism probably has really, really good arguments for it right now, and that internalism was on the wane, but internalism is now meeting those objections and putting forward some interesting stuff. So like, it's a really interesting conversation, and I'm just like, where do I end up on here? And so like, I don't really have anything riding on either camp, either way, other than like, I guess if it turns out that internalism is true, I can just say, oh, well, externalism, all these externalist views are false because internalism is true. So I guess I could, but I guess I could have something riding on it in that sense. But I just, what's the right way to solve this puzzle? I haven't quite decided.
Yeah, me
and
either.
I'll change my mind next week.
Yeah, I've actually heard people using G.E. Moore's argument who's gotten people to deny their hands exist, and I'm just like,
at that point I'm just like, okay, well, now you're just playing into the troll's hand, like that's exactly what the troll wants you to do, so you can just be a troll.
Yeah, there is no way out of the hole of solipsism. So if you run into somebody that's a solipsist, just run the other way. Don't just go. It's not worth it. It's a rabbit hole that's not worth it.
You might want to be careful, because as Plantigo once quipped, if they go, we go.
That's right. Okay, because I actually made that joke the other day. I think it was on the last show, because the guy was he said he was borderline solipsist, just messing around, and it was, I think, Craig that said that if you're, solipsist, please don't stop thinking about me, because I'm not going to exist anymore. So I didn't realize.
You asked me what I was listening to. One of the ones I just finished. Again, I'm preparing for a fine-tuning discussion, so I read Plantiga's, re-listened to Plantiga's Where the Conflict Really Lies, because he has an entire chapter in it on the fine-tuning argument and some of the.
Okay, I've read a reduced version of it, but I haven't read the whole. It's just way too much there for me. So
I read it early on, so I don't think I took away the things that I needed to really take away with it. So the reread was very good. I'm really bad. I've got this whole stack of just unread books that I just have that I need to get through, and I just keep wasting my time. I keep spending my time, rereading things. I'm like, why am I doing this? Like I should read the things that are new, that need to be read. Why am I rereading things? But I just,
I'm with you. I think I have a record for the most started and unfinished books ever, and then I keep buying more books or more. My Audible has about 10 books I haven't finished listening to.
I've discovered that collecting books and reading books are two entirely different hobbies.
I gotta get that book. And
there's so many. I have spent extra money to get books early that I have then just not gotten read until after, when their regular release date would have been, and I'm like, why did I do this?
I used to think I would see a book, years ago. I'd see a book, it's like $100 online. I'm like, well, that's crazy. And I'm like, now it's like, that's only $100. I need to get that book, So because some of them that are 500 pages, almost 1,000 pages, they're almost like textbooks, and they just wealth of knowledge. So
I also have a comic book habit too, so that doesn't help either, because I'm the same way with I got to get this comic, and I've got probably 3 or 4 boxes of comics that I haven't read yet, and I'm like, I'll get around. I'll get around to reading those trade backs, and I'll get around to reading that.
I'm glad I never got into that. Yeah, we didn't have comics when I was a kid. We were in the hood, so the hood. There's not too many comic readers, but I probably would have done the same thing. I'd have been buying them to read them, and they'd stay in the little package, and I'd read the front and back or something, and I'll get to it later. So, but yeah, Ben, man, I am very thankful you came on to hang out with us. Keep it usually around an hour because my attention span, I know their attention spans got to be at least half as bad. So tell us one more time where everybody can find you.
So Real Atheology, a philosophy of religion podcast. So look us up wherever you like to get your podcasts from. Follow us on Twitter and Facebook, and subscribe to us on YouTube. Hopefully we'll be getting some more videos out there pretty soon. I know we've kind of neglected the YouTube channel here recently, but
there's still good stuff.
It will return. It will return. Yeah. I just had a kid, so I'm having to be very, very deliberate with all of my time, and so the content creation, the content creation part is stretched thin.
That's not your kid, Ben. It's way too cute to be your kid. So.
That's what I said. I was like, how in the world did I help make? Like, I made this kid.
Yeah, absolutely, man. I appreciate you coming on. I'd like to have you back in the future. Maybe spend some time on an actual topic.
For sure. Just let me know. Because even if it's a topic that I haven't done, I'm always looking for new projects. I'm always making discussion briefs like these of just various topics. So hopefully I can help contribute in substantive ways, and hopefully that we can have a conversation that helps me put ink to paper.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, talking about it's a lot different than putting it on paper. So I'm with you all the way there.
And I need to write things down so I can talk about them better. I need to talk about things so I can write them down. You know, there's some sort of vicious circle going on in there.
I think it's got something to do with our ADHD, maybe.
Something. I'm sure.
We need to hear it 15 times and then we finally get it. So
yeah.
All right, bud. I appreciate it, man. I'm going to bounce you out and see them out. Thank you for joining.
Thank you for having me. Y'all stay safe.
All right, bud. Ben Watkins, Real Atheology. Ben has been a friend of mine. I consider him a friend in philosophy for years now. Two of the biggest atheists that I've had as influences in philosophy is him and Brett Abney. And Brett Abney was on one of my earlier shows. So if you haven't seen that show, you definitely want to check it out. He's a pretty genius guy himself. So Ben is a real smart guy. Go check him out over at Real Atheology. And I thank everybody for joining us tonight. Sorry for the technical difficulties earlier. It was one of those days. It's been one of those weeks. We are going to have Murder Shed Steve back to finish up the cliffhanger story that he was going to share with us. Not sure when that'll be yet, but it'll be pretty soon. So appreciate you joining us. We'll be back, I believe, Tuesday night, 7 p.m. I'm not sure exactly who the guest is yet. I have somebody I think is confirmed, but I will release the information on it and you will know then. Thank you, guys.